Welcome. My name is Andrea Sonier. Today for the webcam, we're going to talk about Education Interpreting 101-2, and this webcam is a development of that as well. And the Look Like Natural Deaf Center. Today I have with me Professor Brenda Schick. First, I'm going to talk a little about me. So, I used to be a teacher for the deaf, and I grew up deaf mainstream program. And it was an interesting experience, but now I'm here at Gallaudet University studying a program called Class Deaf Students. My focus today is deaf students with color. So thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. So I used to also be a teacher for the deaf. I am a CODA, and I grew up in a family with that. Today I'm studying language development and with students of hard of hearing, deaf and hard of hearing. So today is we want to discuss the controlling and observing of the education interpreters and the environment of the education. Also, we want to focus on how education teachers, how the teachers can support the interpreters. And last, we also want to talk about the students and the parents and what they can do to support. We're going to start with the school. They focus on helping the personal development and for them to grow in language and development and knowledge, the social, emotional development, anything kind of a development, what qualifications and characteristics the interpreter needs. A community interpreter is different from an educational interpreter. You need to know that's important. The importance of legislation, the policies, the fundamentals for interpreting. We have federal control in here, in the schools. Like IEP 404, individualized plan. It's important to be able to continue with this hard of hearing because so they can have that access of communication during the situations. Up to this point, IEP individual program, they're serving, they're matching, also they require education to teach the students of LUE. Up to this day, students, deaf and hard of hearing, they have that access communication with school and education interpreters. They have many different ways to progress with leaders that give them free access to match their education. I think it's important to be able to focus on this goal when interpreters don't know that they're a service provider. And it's a formal thing, meaning they are members of the education team. It's their responsibility to follow the student, the IEP, the 404 plan, and monitor and just continue to progress. I've often experienced that before of a hard of hearing student. I've noticed the word is relationship with the server. What is the role of that? The role of RIP is to provide service to the students, to provide access to their education. We have all of the RIPs, for example, lip reading, audiovisual, interpreter, school psychologist, a PT, and an OT. All of these are for UIP. So who decides if an interpreter is qualified to be an interpreter in education? That's a really interesting question to ask. It's different for community interpreter, but most states, the state development they have an education interpreter. They monitor, they see them in the school, how they serve the interpreter, if they're qualified to serve. That's a good point, though. As the teachers in all education, they recognize, they lip read and audio. The interpreter for the deaf, it's a natural interpreting situation. And and you'll see that they are qualified. But they are limited to decide, the policies of the education interpreter. The State Department, they can't and they will not give up their responsibility to set up this. So all of the states have the same qualities for the interpreters? Well, they're not the same. Most of them use EIPA. An interpreter, they visualize to see if they're qualified interpreter. So I know EIPA. Can you elaborate on that, please? Sure. So EIPI is an evaluation, and they use tools to see if they're qualified interpreter. They're the processing, what's in the interpreter, like signing and speaking, interpreting. And they range from 0 to 5. So there's different states that have different levels of EIPA qualifications. Some states show 3.0. In my opinion, that's really low. In other states, they have 3.5. And I still think that's pretty low. And more states, are changing and they're accepting 4.0. And I think that's honestly a better qualification. I noticed myself, as a student in Louisiana, an education interpreter, and moved to DC, that there's different skills. Why do states have different skills for interpreters? A lot of people ask me that question. Really, honestly, all of the education interpreters have 5.0. For that would be my dream. But to have all of the states have a 5.0 interpreters, it's a challenge. To receive a 5.0 on the IAP. To receive a 4.0 is a challenge. So I've been discussing with people I work with to see, if we should keep it the same and if it's enough, but we don't know what to do. There's always a challenge for the states to discuss that. So recently I explained the experience for education interpreters. Can I ask, how many people, different education interpreters, and become an interpreter? Can you explain that? Of course. So I'm sure some start with a community interpreter. It's different from, they have the community, they're a member of the RID, and they follow the Code of Professional Conduct. An interpreter can and can't do different things in situations. Like, for example, Code of Ethics. There are 2 principles that are important to follow discussing with education interpreting. In that community of interpreting, you have yourself, and you work with a lot of adults. The adults that have the same rights as me as an interpreter. What this means is that they don't understand. You can ignore them, but what you can do, and you can follow them, and you can decide to learn from them or not to learn from them. It's your right as an adult. Also, you can follow confidentiality. That is important. As an interpreter, you're involved with deaf and hard of hearing consumers, and it's against the law to learn from what is during the interpreting performance assignment. It is their information, their confidential information to share. It's not your confidential information to share as an interpreter. So as a deaf adult, you need to be equal as an interpreter and a deaf adult, but you have a limit and responsibilities to understand. Deaf education it's not enough for the job to be able to challenge interpreting different situations, but you can change, but you really can't. Thank you for explaining that. And now education interpreter is different. So what's the role? Well, it's very different, like you said, but the goal is for federal State Department of Education explains this thing, that the role of education team is to provide authority, agency, or organization like OSHA, right here they have a paper, a form. That's really important. And it's because it's very different from community interpreting. As a member of the education team, meaning that the interpreter, they must communicate with all of the members of the education team. And they can't choose not to discuss anything with one specific one. It is very important in the community interpreting because it is different. Interpreters must communicate with the education team. I have some interpreters, they're like, I can't talk with the classroom teacher because they're of confidentiality, but they're wrong. In the school, it's not the same. So Andrew, I have a question for you. As an interpreter situation, in your experience with education interpreting, what are some things education interpreter? Did you have one? Could you go to the IEP meeting with that? That's strange. I thought all of my IEP meetings were rare. I have an interpreter there. I didn't have an interpreter, but I had one. The role was for me. I had my parents there, my teacher was there, but the interpreter was there, not part of the education team, but he was there for me to interpret. I thought it was interesting. My experience with the mainstream program has different interpreters throughout the day. I'd have 5 different interpreters. I had an interpreter, like the coordinator. Is he part of the team, or is it more an interpreter? That's an interesting point. As an interpreter, it's a good situation. Many of you have interpreting. You need to analyze, but that situation, is important to have an interpreter to provide in the IEP meeting. It's also a good point when you described there the IEP meeting. There's also an interpreter that was not an education team member, and it's really important to have those as separate roles. As the interpreter during the IEP meeting, to provide that information that you cannot interpret. And it's good for the interpreter to be there for the student, not to provide the information for the team. You need both roles. And it's important, and it's a good point to bring up. Thank you for that. Now we have a question from the audience.